It's a very great pleasure to welcome you all here today. And I know for many, many people around the world, it's a very challenging time, of course, with coronavirus. I think that gives a special meaning to be able to join together as a community of people working on climate finance all around the world and share this experience. It's great to see all the introductions that people are making in the chat. That's extremely welcome. People from everywhere, and many of our good friends are there. We're working with many of you as we speak right now. My name is Grant Ballard-Tremere. I think many of you know that. I'm the director of the company called ECO that is hosting this webinar. ECO specializes in the design and development of climate finance projects, including for the GCF. And obviously it's in that context that we've worked with many of you on the webinar. We've got a busy agenda today. We will talk about our GCF Insight, which is on project financing, specifically addressing questions of blended co-financing and understanding from around the world on that. We have my colleague Ben and also a guest from CMIA, Margaret-Ann Splawn, who will be giving us some insights of the recent board meeting 25 that took place in Geneva earlier this month. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So we'll get going almost straight away here. Just to mention that we'll be sending out a webinar replay kit afterwards. If you like to receive that, do sign up for our latest thinking list to receive it, and we'll give you the links for that during the course of the webinar. And that webinar replay kit will have the recording, the video recording that we're presenting today, and also the questions and our written answers to them, and some other resources that are mentioned during the session. Yeah, so I think that's everything for an introduction. It's my great privilege to welcome you here. Submit your questions in the chat as we go. We'll answer them, and let's get going. As a first presentation, we will be talking about the 14th GCF Insight publication that we did that focused on blended co-financing, on project financing within the context of this climate finance funding from GCF, from other climate funds. This is, of course, addressing climate finance knowledge gaps according to stakeholders, and one of the top gaps that was identified in the previous edition of our GCF Insight. The speaker today will be my colleague, Dr. Sylvia Emily. She's a consultant with us, has 8 years of experience in the sustainable energy and climate change sectors, and she's worked in several African countries in particular. At ECO, she's worked on developing GCF project proposals, both concept notes and the full funding proposals, and she's been involved in building capacity of local stakeholders in many locations around the world to access climate finance. So without any further ado, let's shift over to Sylvia to hear her presentation.
Thank you, Grant. This 14th edition of the GCF Insight explores stakeholders' experiences and challenges with project financing, and also discusses some of the implications for the Green Climate Fund. In the last edition of GCF Insight, we asked stakeholders to identify the top 5 climate finance knowledge gaps. And knowledge surrounding project financing, financial instruments, and an understanding of financial systems was considered to be the biggest gap for accessing climate finance. So in this edition, we looked more in details at why project financing is such a challenge for many stakeholders. And climate projects must address financial barriers, must demonstrate the least concessionality levels, must catalyze private and private sector investments, and demonstrate financial viability and sustainability in the long term. So in order to do so, project developers really require not just a sophisticated financial literacy, but also a solid understanding of climate project financing and how to best employ the mechanism that the GCF offers in order to drive transformational change. The report is based on a mix of primary data collection and literature review. We conducted an online quiz to challenge stakeholders to test their knowledge on basic concept of climate project financing, and we collected 104 respondents from across the world. We also used a similar version of the quiz during a face-to-face training in Indonesia that we conducted in January on GCF proposal development. And there were 50 participants in this training from private sector stakeholders, local government, and civil society organizations. Then we conducted 3 semi-structured interviews with stakeholders from Africa and the Caribbean region to gather views from different perspectives from an international accredited entity, a financial entity currently pursuing GCF accreditation, and a UN agency who is not accredited but is supporting local actors in accessing GCF funds. And this is what we found in this report. First, respondents were generally familiar with banking and finance language, and most of them have experience with grant financing, while other financial instruments have been less used. So among the respondents that said to have climate finance experience, over the majority of them had experience with grants, followed by blended finance and consensual loans. And this is somehow also reflected in the allocation of the GCF fund as of February 2020. The large portion of funding, 45%, was allocated to grants, followed by loans, while other financial instruments such as equity and guarantees have been less used. Overall, quiz participants responded correctly to most questions with a mean score of 10 out of 14. And questions on specific financial terminologies such as the definition of internal rate of returns or the definition of net present value were considered more challenging. Another interesting aspect that came out from this study was the different resources that are available to project developers for project preparation and for project preparation of financial aspects of the project. So, for example, in the case of international accredited entities, they can rely on in-house units that focus only on the financial economic analysis, while a financial institution can also rely on in-house expertise to design climate projects. A second interesting finding was that while many climate finance stakeholders have a working knowledge of financial instruments and project finance, they may lack a full understanding of how sources of climate finance can and should be used to leverage other investments. So we found that there is a distinct lack of understanding of key concepts such as incrementality and concessionality, and also how to incorporate this concept into project proposals. The definition of incremental cost of climate change and its implication for project financing was considered particularly challenging, even for those respondents who said to have a lot of climate finance experience. And in this case, familiarity with grant instruments and also low awareness of GCF requirements may result in difficulties for stakeholders to justify requests for concessional finance and to demonstrate the incremental value of that finance. In practice, we should also say that concessionality levels depend on various barriers to financing, and they should be tailored to the specific context. For example, an interviewee working in small island and developing states in the Caribbean region expressed that while is it justified to see high level of grant disbursements in SIDS and in this type of context, the GCF has also raised expectations in regard to co-financing. So it's not just about understanding when concessional finance could work, but also what other type of instruments can be matched when requesting grants. A third interesting finding emerging from the report was that obtaining co-financing is considered a challenging aspect of project financing and has been flagged by various stakeholders. So the determination of co-financing and particularly matching available finance with climate project proposals is very challenging, and project proponents struggle to match government priorities with potential projects that could be bankable from their perspective. To this regard, the limited capacity of NDAs and environmental ministries was mentioned as a barrier to the identification and structuring of appropriate project co-financing. And it was also particularly reported to be difficult in some cases due to the changing government priorities and the difficulties that emerge with matching bankable projects. Another key barrier highlighted by interviewees was the lack of cooperation among climate focal points and financial institutions. Lastly, an obstacle that was mentioned in obtaining co-financing included the lengthy processes for GCF disbursements and the related risk in changing commitments between project formulation and implementation. So some stakeholders mentioned that, for example, due to the volatile situation in certain countries, ensuring the co-financing committed at project submission somehow it cannot be guaranteed at the moment when the funds get disbursed, and this has proven to be a challenge in some context. The study identified, as it was mentioned by one of the stakeholders, the need to help people understand the type of information that needs to be put into proposals so that they are bankable. So some of the key takeaways from the study is obviously the need for ad hoc capacity building, which means also the availability of ongoing expert advice, as well as awareness raising. So there is a need to strengthen the capacity of governments to identify and prioritize projects that can mobilize other investments. To this regard, readiness funding was considered a key entry point to help countries in becoming more strategic, in developing a pipeline of bankable projects, and in also disseminating awareness and creating capacity of local stakeholders to actually identify what type of projects can be bankable from a climate fund perspective, but also from the private sector perspective. Another obstacle that was mentioned and something that could require some attention was regarding to the fund timelines and the complex accreditation requirements that so far have inhibited the participation of certain stakeholders, certain financial institutions in participating in the climate finance landscape. And moving forward, these efforts, whether is it capacity building, whether is it using readiness funds, or improving the efficiency and effectiveness of the fund, all these efforts need to be coupled with dialogue between financial institutions, climate focal points, as well as private sector stakeholders and accredited entities. And I suggest you to go on our website, please have a look at our report, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, your questions, and thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sylvia. Much appreciated that insight from a very interesting study here. Fantastic. Yes, do go onto our website to pick up that document. My apologies to anyone that's having trouble with the sound. As I mentioned in the chat, we're monitoring it from many locations, and we think it's going out fine from our end. So it could be something to do with connection or the setup or such like. We will be sending out the webinar kit, which will have the full recording of it as well, so that you can hear the words that Sylvia said. To go on to the next item, we had our colleague Ben Bartle, senior consultant, at the recent GCF board meeting. And also we're privileged to have on this webinar here Margaret-Ann Splawn. Both of them attended the board meeting that was held in Geneva. As you no doubt know, that's coronavirus related. Many of the people from the GCF Secretariat were sent out of Korea early in order to be able to attend that board meeting. Many interesting discussions took place there, so we're looking forward to hear the updates. The presentation will be made by Ben. Ben is one of our senior consultants. He has over 10 years of experience in project formulation work. That's both for the GCF and the Global Environment Facility, amongst others. He works with climate finance readiness work as well, capacity building and training at the country level with NDAs or with stakeholder groups and such like. Ben is a board director also of the Climate Markets and Investment Association, or the CMIA. And that leads on well to introduce Margaret-Ann, who is the director, the executive director of the CMIA. CMIA is Carbon Markets and Investment Association. Margaret-Ann has over 20 years trading experience in capital and environmental markets, and she's the active private sector observer for the GCF. So she attends board meetings as the official private sector observer. And she's a member of the Energy Sustainability and Climate Task Force of the B20, which is the official G20 dialogue with the business community. So without further ado, if they would take the floor and give us a presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Grant. A couple of weeks ago, as Grant mentioned, I attended Geneva for the 25th meeting of the board. Geneva was the new home for this board meeting, given the exceptional circumstances due to the breakout of COVID-19. And I'm going to go through the following presentation to give you an idea of what actually happened at that board meeting. So there were quite a few sticky topics during B25. The board spent the majority of time in executive sessions, which is practically behind closed doors, and that was around the GCF strategic plan. We'll look at the few projects approved and a report back on the portfolio by the executive director of the Green Climate Fund. We'll look at the accredited entities that actually weren't approved, that were applying for accreditation, and a short update on policies and reports from the Independent Evaluation Unit. And then we'll look at dates moving forward. Following my presentation, there will be a short presentation from the Active Private Sector Observer from developing countries, that's Margaret-Ann Splawn, who's also the director from Climate Markets and Investments Association, and she'll give a short presentation after my one. As you could see from the picture on the previous slide, there was a bit of distance between board members there in the boardroom. The reason being is that the UN head of the UN Permanent Mission for Switzerland, Valentin Zwelliger, who invited and welcomed everybody to Geneva, said that it was that the board members simply weren't following the social distancing practices, so they spread them out a little bit further during the meeting. He also remarked on the noteworthy results and achievements of the GCF in its previous 8 years. It's important to note that there are 2 new co-chairs at the helm for 2020. That's Sue Sasbo from Canada, representing developed nations, and Newman Bhatti from Pakistan, representing developed nations. Obviously, a hot topic, given the times, was COVID-19 and its impact on the functioning of the GCF and whether or not another board meeting would actually be physically possible this year. Discussion between board members was around whether it would be possible to host a remote board meeting, and the issue mainly raised by developing country nations was that internet connectivity would not allow for such a board meeting to take place effectively, and it was suggested that in between board meeting decisions would need to be made in the absence of a physical board meeting. Now, it's important to note that out of the many board meetings I've been to, only 6.5 hours roughly were publicly open board meeting hours during the 3-day meeting. So a little over 2 hours a day. The majority of time was spent discussing with other observers in the room and in and out of the observer area. Now, the major reason for the board meeting to be held behind closed doors was to discuss the GCF strategic plan, of which working groups were broken into in order to find common ground on. I'll have a little bit more on that on a coming slide. Another sticky topic was the report from the Executive Director on the performance of the Green Climate Fund's request for proposals, but mainly for REDD+ and mobilising funds at scale for private sector projects. Now, in order for the GCF to meet its targets for various sectors and share of countries with specific funding targeted at least developed countries and small island developing states, for example, the GCF often issues requests for proposals which target projects in these countries. According to the Executive Director of the GCF, the RFP for the pilot program for REDD+, which is results-based payments for reduced emissions from forest degradation, deforestation, was working, that the RFP was actually successful and they were able to allocate the targeted funds to approve REDD+ projects earlier than expected. However, another RFP issued by the fund, the private sector-oriented Mobilising Funds at Scale RFP, was proving difficult due to the issue that some of the entities that had seemed to have submitted truly transformative projects did not easily meet the fund's accreditation criteria. And getting these organisations accredited was proving difficult and problematic, as many of these, as a result, many of these projects remain on the shelf. Later on in the second day, outside of the Executive Director's report, there was a review presented of REDD+ pilot program's results. The Secretariat outlining the positive responses from countries that the 6 projects, from the 4 countries actually that the project has been implemented in, and then the 6 countries that are in pipeline. However, the civil society active observer disagreed that the pilot program should move forward with the additional 500 million that's been set aside for those additional countries. They raised issues of permanence of carbon storage, avoiding double counting between programs operating at different levels, project level, national level, and transboundary. Also verification of engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And they said that there is much work need to be done in regards to engaging with the private sector on these issues. Another issue that the Executive Director raised was the issue with accreditation master agreements with private sector, or AMAs. The issue being that it's proving difficult to sign these with regulated financial institutions such as development banks. Only 4 private sector entities currently develop projects with the GCF that are accredited. While 20 are accredited, they don't have an agreed accreditation master agreement in place. Many people that were there that we had discussions with, Margaret-Ann and myself, agreed that it's a very difficult stumbling block to mobilise private sector resources at scale. And the GCF Secretariat reiterated to us that they're working tirelessly to overcome these issues. However, this puts into question whether this is in fact a fit-for-purpose accreditation system. Now on to the nuts and bolts, the project approvals at the board meeting. Unfortunately, there were only 6 funding proposals submitted at this at B.25, and several board members complained that this was simply not enough projects, and all were from international access entities and none from direct access, which was also a very contentious issue. Board member Jeremiah Sokan, who represents developing countries from LDCs, pointed out that having no direct access proposals is really inconsistent with country ownership, and the GCF is obviously explicit about the importance of country ownership. The notion of country ownership, he reiterated, is to ensure GCF activities are in harmony with national priorities. Regarding the small number of funding proposals, the Executive Director responded that the GCF's ITAP had comments and issues on 3 projects, one of which was actually submitted by a direct access entity that was in the pipeline for approval at this board. However, those issues could not be resolved before the meeting. He also stated that there is a healthy portfolio with stronger representation of direct access entities that will be presented for approval at both B26 and B27, with approximately $1 billion worth of projects presented at each. Now, taking a quick look at those 6 projects approved, 4 of the 6 were public sector submissions. 3 of these were adaptation projects from Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe, representing a total of $96.6 million requested from the GCF. One project in particular, FP126, submitted by the Republic of Cuba through the accredited entity FAO, had major board support as a cross-cutting project increasing climate resilience of rural households and communities through rehabilitation of production of landscapes in selected localities. However, the US board members said they could not approve this project due to alleged mismanagement of funds in previous agricultural projects and accused the government of Cuba for not doing enough to stop human trafficking. Now, the GCF has procedural guidelines in a case where a board member doesn't want to approve a project. Adopted at B23 last year, these decisions on making a decision in the absence of consensus had to be utilised and in order to approve FP126. On the final day, 22 board members actually voted to approve, 0 abstained from voting, and the US did not vote against only because they were no longer present at the board meeting on the final day. Due to new travel restrictions being imposed in various countries due to COVID-19, many attendees, many board members had to return home, and it's likely the US left early because of this. There were 2 private sector projects approved. They were submitted under the request for proposals for mobilising funds at scale, the one I mentioned earlier, launched in 2017. And those projects were, one was a sustainable forestry fund taking place in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, and the other project was a scaling smart solar energy access for microgrids in Haiti. The first project was submitted by the Abaro Fund and the other one by NEFCO. And the Abaro Fund project submitted using the accredited entity MUFG Bank Japan. So an interesting setup there. Another sticky topic, as I mentioned, was the accreditation of new accredited entities and the upgrading of one existing entity. The board could not agree on the voting for the approval of new accredited entities, largely due to the late delivery to the board of documentation for this. Gaining accreditation takes a long time, and several board members, namely Lars Roth from Sweden and Joss Wheatley from the UK, commented they didn't have sufficient time to study documentation, which was only just received the weekend before B25. And they had a duty of care to conduct proper due diligence procedures and protocol in order to accept the approval of these new proposed accredited entities. One noteworthy thing to mention was the active civil society observer made an intervention stating they had serious concerns with one of the applicants, that one of the applicants were heavily invested in mining, and that they may also have links to the murder of an activist, biologist, and thus the proper due diligence processes may not have been made. Other board members argued against this and said that given the exceptional circumstances that the due diligence was actually done by the Secretariat. However, on the final day, the decision was finally deferred to an in-between board meeting decision, or a BBM. This proved quite a contentious measure given the fact that all of these entities were direct access entities. Now, the GCF the board was really here to agree upon their updated strategic plan, which sets out their objectives for the next 4 years. And while it was on the agenda for a decision at the meeting, there were 6 contentious issues within that strategic plan that needed to become further resolved, shall we say, before a vote of approval could take place. These issues were, and they were divided, and the GCF board were divided into closed-door groups to discuss the strategic objective and allocation of GCF resources, shifting financial flows, project prioritization, a range of diversifying instruments, financially and accreditation-wise, accreditation prioritization, and efficient process management and delegation. Unfortunately, the GCF board were unable to make a final decision on this, and it will be pushed forward to B.26. The Independent Evaluations Unit also presented its yearly report from 2018-2019. They showed that the country ownership review has been completed. All of these reports can be found online, by the way. The environmental and social safeguards was completed. The rapid assessment of simplified approval process and the independent evaluation unit assessment of that is going to be presented at B26, as is the synthesis of GCF accreditation process. Finally, moving forward, the GCF board really remains divided on their strategic plan for the next 4 years, largely due to politics. Several board members also serve as ministers and negotiators at the COP, which can complicate the process of forming consensus, which are actually in the best interest of the fund. Yet board members remain united, obviously, in advancing and helping the most vulnerable nations and societies impacted by climate change. However, in this way, many mentioned that the GCF represents a walking dichotomy of a board unable to somehow move forward and meet its objectives and have a clearly outlined strategic plan. B26 was tentatively scheduled to be held from the 23rd to the 25th of June in Songdo. However, given exceptional circumstances of COVID-19, the co-chairs and the secretariat will be monitoring the situation, and the dates and venue could be subject to change. Thank you for listening, and now I believe Margaret-Ann.
Thank you to Ben and the ECO team for inviting me as a guest on your webinar to speak briefly about the 25th meeting of the GCF board. My name is Margaret-Ann Splawn, and I am the active private sector observer at the Green Climate Fund for the Developed Nations constituency. I also serve as the executive director of the Climate Markets and Investment Association, which we refer to as CMIA. CMIA is a non-profit trade association comprised of private sector companies united in a mission to stimulate a shift in the direction and scale of private and public financial flows into investments which are consistent with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We represent the voice of the private sector, and we recognize that economic development and climate security go hand in hand. Our association provides a safe space for public and private sector to share knowledge and exchange ideas on a variety of topics, from market design to investments. We are consulted by governments who want to learn and understand what is workable, bankable, and scalable in the real economy. We have observer status at the UNFCCC, the GCF, and the Climate Investment Funds. The GCF is mandated to include 2 active observers from civil society and 2 from the private sector, with 1 representative from developing and developed countries each. The purpose of these observers is to provide expertise and insight from their peer group to help shape and inform board decision-making. These observers are self-selected by their peers and not selected by the GCF. The active observers actually sit in the boardroom and attend board committee meetings and can make interventions on agenda items. For example, there was an informal board meeting in February in Monrovia, Liberia, and only active observers could attend. I was the only business person in the room, where I was able to make official interventions. However, I see part of my role as building relationships with board members, their advisors, and the secretariat outside of the boardroom in order to share and understand where the bottlenecks are for development. I take this knowledge and engage with my peers to help find solutions and create opportunities for the private sector to engage and do business with the GCF. Observers must have a deep knowledge of private sector developments and trends on climate, but no one can know everything. This is one of the reasons I'm here today, to share with you how you can participate and contribute. The GCF has a draft strategic plan for the next 4 years, and the fact that it wasn't adopted at B.25 doesn't prevent us from advancing on our side. We know that the GCF wants to catalyze private sector finance at scale, plus create a private sector engagement and outreach plan. We can contribute to the design and development of this. The current draft of the strategic plan can be found on their website. The document number is on this slide. I'd welcome your comments on this, but also comments if you have dealt with the GCF and struggle, for example regarding funding proposals or time delay, and suggestions for improvements to documents, processes, and/or procedures. My email is on the slide, and if you want to be on the distribution list for GCF communications from the private sector, just drop me an email.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Margaret-Ann. Much appreciated. To get us some insight into how the active observer works and where people can interact with you better to be able to have an influence within the board meetings. That's very much appreciated. And Ben, thanks also for that detailed insight into the decisions and discussions and lack of decisions and complexities related to this last board meeting. I think that raises quite a few questions that we'll be able to address now. We have approximately 20 minutes or so to go through them. Many of you have written on the chat and in the questions section of it, and I think we can just try and tackle them one by one, probably in the order they came. Let me just make sure here to give voice to my colleagues. I need to make some little slight adjustments. Here we go. So the first question Manohar asked, how is the impact of internationalization of environmental mitigation costs viewed while assessing the bankability of projects? For that, perhaps it's not something that I fully understand in terms of the question here, but I can give you some insights about how the GCF addresses the issues of the environmental mitigation costs. And within funding proposals. And also we could talk a little bit about the other aspects related to additionality and those sorts of factors. If you want to provide more insight into your question on the chat so that I can give a more specific, more precise answer, please do. So, firstly, in terms of the this part about GCF funding proposals, how they address internalization of environmental mitigation costs. When you submit the full funding proposal, many of those on the call who have actually submitted them will be very familiar with the financial and economic analysis that you have to complete. This is provided in an Excel format as well, in which many of these environmental mitigation costs are made explicit within the cash flow analysis, within the analysis of the project and the environmental and the economic benefits that a project brings. So from that perspective, how is it addressed? Well, it's addressed through an analysis that produces both the internal rate of return of the project or net present value of the project, plus an economic internal rate of return that internalizes many of those costs. If the mitigation costs are being internalized anyway, this is an opportunity to make those explicit within the context of a GCF project. So I'm not too sure if that addresses the question you have. If you'd like to provide a little bit more insight into it in the chat, that would be much appreciated. In terms of the next question, shall we take they're coming in quick here. Perhaps the next one was from Ulrich. I think my colleagues will note to me if I skip any of them. Ulrich, you asked about the monitoring of GCF projects. How does GCF make sure that the activities are well conducted, funds used properly for that purpose? Is it based on M&E from the accredited entity? Ben, did you wish to provide some answer to that? You need to come back onto the stage, I think, if that's the case. I am not. Yeah, there you are then. Good.
Great. Hi, thanks for that, Grant. Ulrich, to answer your question, yes, there are monitoring and evaluation frameworks established within GCF projects as part of the funding proposal submitted. The project developers or accredited entities are required to describe how the project will be monitored for the results. What will be used to monitor those results is called a results framework. Many people on the call may be familiar with log frames or results frameworks, and these are used to monitor the impacts of the project, but also there are execution monitoring programs established and set out very clearly in the proposal package submitted to the GCF, including a monitoring and evaluation framework as an annex to the proposal. There will also be a midterm evaluation and a terminal evaluation at the end of each project, with yearly reports to GCF on things such as finance dispersed, number of people trained, for example, if it's an adaptation project in forestry, number of hectares with increased resilience or planted, for example. If it's a mitigation project, monitoring of results will be things like reduced greenhouse gas emissions or energy savings, for example.
Yes, and perhaps to add to that, Ben, in terms of the financial management of a project, there is requirements for regular auditing of the accounts of a project. The accredited entity needs to hire an auditing firm to carry out that audit, and the reports need to be submitted along with the annual reporting for projects. So it is done and organized by the accredited entity in the main. And then there is monitoring that GCF Secretariat itself can carry out too, visiting projects, interacting with them and such like. We're doing some work for a client of ours in a GCF project where they're changing some of the structure of the project as it develops, how the GCF money is used for a particular case. And for that particular project, the GCF Secretariat is very hands-on in terms of requirements and documentation that is required in order to make such change during project execution. So hopefully, Ulrich, that answers your question. Let us know in chat if it's not sufficient. And the next question we have is from Samir. He's saying, how is equity or reverse auction being used and in what type of projects? For this one, to my knowledge, if any of my colleagues know otherwise or anyone on the chat, I don't think reverse auction mechanism is being used at the moment in any GCF projects. Equity is fairly common in projects. It comes in two different forms. GCF itself can provide equity. So it can put forward equity into a project. We know quite a number of them in which the GCF becomes an equity partner. Someone from the Secretariat then has got a role on the board of the organization or the fund that is being created. As would be the case for normal equity arrangement. And then, of course, equity can be provided as co-financing into projects as well. GCF requirement for all co-financing is that it's new and additional. So we are looking at equity that is provided that is new and additional into projects. this could take various different forms. The provision of land, for example, could be an equity investment from a co-financing partner in a project, as far as we know, in these sorts of situations. So, well, hopefully that gives you some insight into that. Again, if you'd like more detail, we can chat one-on-one, or we could ask some additional question within the webinar. So the next one I have on the list is Margaret-Ann. She asks, does the GCF fund projects that marries climate and gender issues? I could give an answer to that, but perhaps one of my colleagues would like to take that on. No take as well. I'll just give a quick answer to this. Sylvia, you're coming on. Would you like to respond here?
Yes, no, I'm happy to respond to this. Thank you, Margaret-Ann. Actually, yes, the GCF is the first fund that really mainstream gender across all the operations. So there is not just a gender policy that needs to be respected, but actually gender consideration needs to be taken into account from the project preparation phase throughout the implementation, and accredited entities are required to submit a gender assessment and gender action plan together with the funding proposal in order to really flesh out in details how the GCF funds are used to ensure gender equality and equity throughout the operation of the project, ensuring inclusiveness in all the activities, as well as accountability, and also how the accredited entities intends to monitor and evaluate the impact on men and women that the project brings. I hope that answers in brief the question.
Okay. Our next question is from Marlene, saying only private sector actors can think along, or also international or normal NGOs. Is this perhaps relating to the observer role, in which case I'll hand the floor to Margaret-Ann. If you can come into the room, here you go.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Margaret-Ann, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this is about observers. I think this is about the observers. As I mentioned before, there's the private sector observers, and then there's the civil society. This relates to another question that was also asked by another gentleman about the observers. The GCF is really keen, or they say that they're very keen to work with the private sector, and they want to, but they certainly don't make it easy, which is one of the reasons why I'm reaching out to the community to say that if you wanted to participate, and if you want to participate into the strategic plan, of which one of the objectives is that they've put is catalyzing private sector finance at scale, then I think we should help facilitate and design what that means, because often many of the board members and their advisors come up and ask us about private sector expertise, insight, and how we could work together, also at a country level. This is not just with developed countries, but also with developing. And so I really think it's important that we work with them. Yes, we know it's difficult. It's a UN designed fund, but at the same time is crowding in the private sector and finding ways to work together to find solutions to help developing countries mitigate and adapt to climate change is really important, which is why please do reach out. You don't necessarily have to be a private sector company. However, the feedback and the advice or insight that I will give will be based on a variety of private sector actors. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Margaret-Ann. Much appreciated.
Sorry, Grant, just to add to what Margaret-Ann said and the question as well, there is an active civil society organisation role in the board as well, alongside Margaret-Ann. This role is formed by many NGOs, many Indigenous peoples foundations in the environment space, and they are one of the more vocal and are very well staffed, shall we say, at the GCF board meeting. They do a lot of interventions on projects where they believe that Indigenous populations issues are at play, or civil society organisations haven't been considered in projects. And in fact, there's been a couple of times where projects have been held back from approval because of these interventions. So to say the role that they play is working very well, I would say it is. But we would like to see a lot more involvement of private sector in the boardroom as well, and that's Margaret-Ann's role is to get the voice of private sector and represent that in the GCF board and in the interventions that private sector can make with concerns they have around projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Ben. Ben, would you like to go straight on with the question from Himeni, who asks about COVID and potential delays, project implementation and such like? Moratorium. Would you like to do that straight away now?
Yes, absolutely. That is a really good question, Himeni, and it was something that was discussed. However, it wasn't on the board agenda. Unfortunately, because of the progress of things, a lot of the time was taken up behind closed doors, discussing the GCF strategic plan, also discussing what COVID-19 and the impacts on project implementation would actually be. It is completely recognised that they will inevitably cause delays to project implementation, specifically with regards to activities that need to be undertaken that involve international travel or international experts or even local experts who would be on lockdown. There was unfortunately not any progress made towards what this means for project timelines and the expectations of the GCF. However, we do expect in between board meeting discussions between board members and also from the Secretariat that this will be on the cards. It will certainly be one of the agenda items at the forefront of the next board meeting, and we also expect that the Secretariat's expectations upon implementation of project, disbursement of funds, achievement of results along timelines are likely to shift, and I think they'd be willing to consider feedback from accredited entities based on the impacts of COVID on their projects, rather than being forceful and expecting delivery of results right away.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. We have many questions, and these are too many questions for us to address in the webinar. Just to mention then, we will send out with the webinar kit each of the questions, including the ones that we don't manage to address now. We will send out sort of a table with the questions and a short response to each of them with that webinar kit, so the full Q&A. So please don't be disappointed if your question doesn't come up. I think perhaps I will address some of the questions that Carlos, you've asked. Firstly, does the GCF develop guidance or standard procedures to estimate all the financial analysis, cost-benefit ratios for adaptation, cost efficiency, etc.? One of the more difficult aspects countries face in preparing proposals. Very good question. The guidance from the GCF is gradually improving and getting better, but to my knowledge at the moment there are not standard procedures related to that financial analysis. What we do as a company is we use normal best practice related to doing a financial and economic analysis. The finance side is sort of a standard cost cash flow analysis. And then to get the economic aspects, there's some very good publications from Asian Development Bank, also from the World Bank, on doing the economic analysis for projects, and we are generally following those. In some cases, this is appropriate to the type of project because more sort of an investment type project is what is covered by those guidelines. In some cases, there are, as you know, for an economic analysis, so many external factors. So, yeah, difficulty in doing that. I would recommend, building capacity related to doing financial analysis, making use of the types of resources for the economic analysis part of it, but there's not set guidelines on that.
Just to add to that briefly, Grant, the executive director of the GCF, Yannick, actually mentioned that the Secretariat has been piloting guidelines with a handful of accredited entities, and these guidelines or the draft guidelines for developing GCF projects, calculating incrementality, looking at adaptation, specifically issues around incrementality for adaptation projects. These guidelines will be released in draft format at B.26 at the next GCF board meeting. But there wasn't much further information on that. In discussions that I had with people from the Secretariat, they have been developing these guidelines with inputs over time from various people, including ECO ourselves, and hopefully they'll be released in time by the next board meeting for input from stakeholders, which is most critical to get that feedback, whether the guidelines are realistic and actually provide the answers that are necessary.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Great. Yeah, the questions we can't answer, please do sign up for our newsletter. The link's online, and we can send you all these details for it. Of course, you're welcome to write to us as well. Sylvia's mentioned to me she'll respond to Lion in the written response, the question that you direct straight to her. Carlos, your second part of your question, how can we convince governments that using blended financing mechanisms are more successful than requesting grants to the GCF? I think we'll have to close with a quick comment on that aspect. For me, this is a really important factor. We, almost invariably, when proposals are submitted to the GCF, which are entirely asking for grants and those sorts of mechanisms, almost invariably we receive from one of the comments within the Secretariat requests to clarify why requests are being made for grants and not for loans or another type of blended finance mechanism. How can one convince governments? I guess it's through building experience and knowledge and capacity for it. And the GCF still is quite a new instrument. We're only on the 25th board meeting of the board, and that experience of using these more possibly more effective types of tools is only gradually building, I think. So it's partly time, it's experience, it's knowledge. Of course, it's normally easier and nicer, shall we say, to request grants, but the feedback from the Secretariat is almost always to go for loans. And these types of instruments can really multiply the funds that are available. It depends, of course, on the beneficiaries, the stakeholders that are targeted by the project. In many cases, these are the most vulnerable people in society. So we need to balance that for different types of projects. Hopefully that was a useful answer. We've got many questions. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's really been a great pleasure in hearing from you and having so much inputs. Yeah, it's a really challenging time for the world, but we need to deal by coming together in this type of virtual setting to support one another related to the coronavirus, of course, but the huge pressing problem that is the medium term and long term has to do with climate change and addressing that. And if we can come together and really take action, as we're seeing around the world now, for climate, what a difference could be made in our society. So thanks to all of you for your interest, for your efforts, for joining us for this short time to think deeper about how we can make better use of the finance, to check in on this. Keep in contact with us. Feel free to email us, to connect with us through our newsletter, online, in all the different places you can find us. It was a great pleasure being with you today. Stay safe. Health to all of you and to your loved ones, and strength within your country. We'll get through this short-term challenging time, and then get through the challenges that climate emergency brings to us as well, if we work together on this. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Goodbye.